On June 24th, 1812, nearly 500,000 men under Napoleon Bonaparte would begin crossing the Niemen River, signaling the beginning of the invasion of Russia, the largest single undertaking Napoleon would ever launch. In December 1812, only some 20,000 men in fine condition would limp back into the Duchy of Warsaw. After 6 months, the once Grande Armée was gone. The invasion, once a spectacle of Europe, had become Napoleon's greatest single disaster. Though 2 more years of fighting would continue before Napoleon's abdication, the French army would never recover from its height when it marched into Russia. Many factors played a part in the scale of the disaster: logistics, weather, key decisions made throughout the invasion, and especially Russian resistance. While many moments during the campaign would prove critical to its success or failure, none are more famous than the decision to march on Moscow and the disastrous retreat that followed. That then begs the question, what would have happened had Napoleon not marched on Moscow? Though it is tempting to rewrite the campaign to avoid the march on Moscow entirely, the reality is that Napoleon never really wanted to take his army all the way to Moscow in the first place, viewing it as too deep into the Russian interior. It would be his inability to pin down the Russian army and destroy it that would draw him ever deeper towards the Russian interior and ultimately Moscow. Only after the capture of Smolensk would the prospect of giving up on destroying the Russian army that year seriously be considered, and ultimately dismissed. Smolensk, therefore, will be our point of divergence. To understand the situation that both sides found themselves in at this point, one must look at the initial stages of the campaign and the years of lead-up before it. The conflict that took place in 1812 between the Russian and French empires was not a surprise to either side. It had been building up for years between the two empires ever since the Treaty of Tilsit. French domination over the continent posed too great a threat to Russia's future, and French interests ran counter to Russia's. Napoleon's continental system slowly weakened the Russian economy, while Russia held back from aiding the French during the War of the Fifth Coalition, despite its treaty obligations to do so. Sitting between the two empires sat the French satellite state, the Duchy of Warsaw, one of Napoleon's greatest allies and a large threat to the Russian Empire, who rightly viewed the Polish desire to restore the former borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a serious threat. Following the end of the War of the Fifth Coalition and the defeat of Austria, relations between the two empires rapidly deteriorated. Napoleon began building up for military operations against Russia, and the Russians began seriously planning for how to combat a French invasion. Russia's record against revolutionary and Napoleonic France was not nearly as bad as Austria's or Prussia's. It had not been the main cause of the greatest defeats in 1805 or 1806, and had fought France nearly to a standstill in 1807 before their defeat at the Battle of Friedland. The much more generous terms Russia secured at the Treaty of Tilsit reflected its strength. Even so, from early on, those in charge of planning for the war, namely Barclay de Tolly, with the support of Tsar Alexander, were well aware of the danger posed by the French army. They therefore planned to retreat from the border to draw Napoleon into Russia, where he would be weakened by his long supply lines and hopefully defeated. The army was significantly expanded in preparation to face the more numerous French army, full of veteran troops. Garrison formations were turned into main army units. Militias would later be formed to support the army once the invasion began. Though this did strain the Russian economy even as the continental system weakened it, greatly limiting just how much could be invested into the army. Economic difficulties partly played into the fact that the French army that invaded in 1812 would greatly outnumber the Russians by several 100,000 men. Reforms to the army, particularly to better conduct large-scale campaigns at the operational level, were undertaken with an expansion of the general staff. Lower-level officers were also desperately needed to command newly formed units. Alexander had long taken on a large number of foreign-born officers, particularly Germans, into the army, an act that, though it provided talented officers, also proved a point of tension between native Russian officers and those of foreign birth. Alexander was also prone to limiting strategic information received by spies to a select number of people, adding to the friction between generals as a select few had the full picture. During the interwar years with France, Russia was engaged in conflicts against both Sweden and the Ottoman Empire. Both of these conflicts meant that when war with France came in 1812, significant forces were initially deployed to the frontiers. In the recently conquered Finland to guard against a possible Swedish attack towards St. Petersburg, and in the south in a war against the Ottomans that was nearly complete. These forces provided tens of thousands of reinforcements later on in the invasion, but were unable to contribute to the initial fighting. Perhaps the greatest challenge posed to Russia in the lead up to the war was the offensive culture that permeated the army. From generals right down to the common soldier, offensive action had been drilled into them as the proper way to fight. This would clash greatly with the ultimate plan to withdraw away from the enemy for an extended period. Coordinating troops across a front as large as Russia while being chased by an army known for its speed and ability to decisively win battles would be no easy feat. After their defeat at the Battle of Jena Auerstadt in 1806, the Prussian army had attempted to retreat in multiple directions, but disintegrated due to their shattered morale, often after running into far numerically inferior French forces. Should things go wrong during the retreat, Russian forces risked being picked apart in a similar fashion. A saving grace for the Russian Empire, however, would be its horses. In terms of sheer numbers, the Russian Empire had access to a huge quantity of horses used to the Russian climate to fill its cavalry ranks and replace losses. On top of this, the Empire's Cossacks provided excellent light cavalry support, allowing the army's hussars greater freedom in their own use. The Russian Empire prepared as well as it could for Napoleon's invasion, with the knowledge that defeat could very well result in subjugation to French ambitions, as had happened to Prussia and Austria before it. Napoleon put significant effort into preparing for the coming war against Russia. He recognized that despite conquering almost the entirety of Europe, Russia would not be defeated easily. A number of problems would have to be overcome to defeat the Russian bear. Of primary concern was supplying the army so far from home, especially once it entered Russia proper. Huge supply depots were established to feed and arm the army. Napoleon spent a significant amount of effort in establishing the supplies necessary to support his invasion. In this regard, however, he was his own worst enemy. On paper, the nearly 500,000-man strong army that would march east looked impressive. In reality, all of these troops had to be fed, equipped, and supplied throughout the campaign. Even just getting troops that are launching off points greatly strained supplies, as many troops had to march halfway across Europe. Once gathered, any concentration of the army greatly reduced their ability to live off more local supplies and took a concentrated effort to keep fed. The difficulty of supplies would only get worse the deeper into Russia the army advanced, while Russian supply lines, if anything, would get easier. Napoleon therefore planned his campaign around the idea that he would not lead his army deep into Russia. He even hoped that Russia would instead launch an offensive into the Duchy of Warsaw, where he could then destroy their army. Many on the Russian side, notably General Bagration, wanted to launch just such a spoiling attack into the duchy, unaware of just how greatly outnumbered they were by the French. Such an offensive likely would have been disastrous and was denied by Barclay and the Tsar, who were more aware of the force imbalance. Once it became clear that the Russians would not strike out against the French, Napoleon settled on his main plan: a swift invasion into Russia with the goal of destroying the Russian field army, forcing Tsar Alexander to accept French peace terms. Achieving this goal was part of the reason Napoleon gathered such a large army of his own. He compelled both Prussia and Austria to contribute troops to the war to boost his numbers. One nation he did not need to force into contributing to the war was the Duchy of Warsaw. Many Poles were enthusiastic at the proposition of war with Russia, wishing to reconquer the territories of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Napoleon welcomed the support, as he hoped the size of his army would force the Russians to stretch their resources and ensure victory in the planned decisive battle. Napoleon, however, was not so supportive of the Polish hopes to restore their former borders at the expense of Russia. Such a demand would be intolerable for Russia unless it was decisively and completely defeated. He therefore rejected proposals by Prince Joseph Poniatowski that advocated for an advance into Ukraine, where Polish nobles might support their invasion. The invasion would go ahead with the aim of destroying the Russian army, to enforce the continental system, not to conquer territory. Upon crossing into Russian territory, the French army was immediately posed with a difficult problem. The Russians were seemingly running away. Napoleon's solution to this problem was a simple one: march faster and catch up to them. French forces had long relied on their speed of march to outmaneuver their enemies, so Napoleon would rely upon it once again. Unfortunately for the French, Russia was not like the rest of Europe. There were fewer roads to march on, and they were of poorer quality than the more densely populated parts of Europe that the French were used to fighting in. Even with repeated force marching, the French failed to pin down the Russian army. As the retreat commenced, the Russians were inferior to the French numerically in many areas, but one area that they were able to match the French was in their light cavalry. The Russian Cossacks proved to be a menace to the French, as they were able to constantly harass and delay the pursuing French at every turn. Even when the French were able to catch up to elements of the Russian rearguard, they were never able to pin down enough of the Russian army to force them to give the decisive engagement Napoleon desired. Even worse for the French was the attrition that they suffered for their efforts. To create an army nearly 500,000 strong, Napoleon had to rely on conscripts to make up a large portion of his force. Green troops not used to hard marching and already tired from marching across Europe just to reach the launching off point of the invasion. The result was massive casualties due to exhaustion and sickness from marching on dusty Russian roads in the heat of summer. Soldiers dropped out of the march to wander the countryside or simply die from sickness. Food was hard to find, as the Russians employed scorched earth policy as they retreated, destroying food and anything else that they thought might be useful for the French. Another side effect of the rapid speed of the advance for the French was that they were outmarching their supply wagons, which struggled greatly to keep up. Supplying armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands was an extremely difficult task, and even the Russians struggled to do so on their home territory for extended periods of time without dispersing their forces over a wide area. While the French certainly suffered greatly during the march, the Russians too suffered as they were driven back rapidly by the speed of the French advance, just to a much lesser extent thanks to being in friendly territory and having greater access to food. The French speed of advance still greatly exceeded Russian expectations, however, and many depots full of supplies had to be abandoned to the French fully intact. It's hard to say how deep into Russia Tsar Alexander or Barclay de Tolly intended to retreat, but reality and necessity certainly forced them significantly farther back than they had hoped. Every day of marching surrendered more ground to the French, and a significant majority of Russian generals wanted to turn and fight the French, rather than continue to retreat. History would prove de Tolly right for sticking to his plan and continuing the withdrawal, but at the time his actions were significantly unpopular, and his German origin made many rally against his leadership, viewing him as an untrustworthy foreigner. Despite the retreat greatly benefiting the Russians, it could not go on forever. Political pressure, both from within and outside the army, meant that they would have to turn and face the French at some point. The speed of the French advance meant that Russian forces struggled to concentrate. It would be at the city of Smolensk, due to its historical significance and the inability of Russian armies to concentrate any sooner, that would lead to the first major battle. The Battle of Smolensk would take place on August 16th and be focused on the city itself, with Russian forces concentrated within the city and behind the nearby Dnieper River. French forces were able to capture the city's suburbs, but were halted at the tall stone walls of the city proper. Napoleon dedicated 3 corps and 200 pieces of artillery to take the city. The ensuing bombardment set much of the city on fire, but failed to breach the walls for some time. By nightfall, it became clear that the city would be lost, and so most of the Russian forces within withdrew from the city, while a small force was left behind to cover the army's retreat. The following morning, on the 17th, the walls would finally be breached and Polish troops would enter the city. After the city's fall, Russian forces would once more resume their retreat, narrowly escaping Napoleon's pursuing force. What followed would be the largest battle of the campaign at Borodino, the burning of Moscow, and the long retreat out of Russia in the depth of winter. But what if Napoleon had not continued on towards Moscow? What would have happened? Once Smolensk was taken, a serious case was made to halt there for the winter, then continue the invasion the following year once weather had improved. The army, after all, had moved far deeper into Russia than initially intended, and was exhausted. Moving on towards Moscow would have stretched the already perilous logistics even further. Historically, Napoleon decided to move on towards Moscow, hoping to force a quick end to the war. But how might things have gone differently if he had halted his advance? Assuming the army halted at or around Smolensk and bunkered down for the winter, they would have been in a better position than historically in terms of supplies and shelter from the elements, but only relative to the complete disaster that was the retreat from Moscow. A whole host of factors would rapidly become extremely important, and Napoleon would have to decide what he would prioritize. By this point, the army had shrunk significantly to only around roughly 150,000 in the main force, with an additional couple tens of thousands in the north and south. Supplying this force would be difficult, especially with the presence of Cossacks and Russian partisans that would pose a constant threat to supply lines. French cavalry had suffered heavily, just like the infantry in the rapid force marching and clashes against the Russian rear guard. By Smolensk, Russian light cavalry therefore had the advantage in numbers, familiarity with the terrain, and ability to replace losses. Any attempt to feed the army sufficiently over the winter would require the army to spread out in an attempt to find local sources of supplies, not destroyed by the Russians. Napoleon would have a short period of time before winter hit to position his army and reinforce his flanks. In an effort to disperse his army along with bolstering the northern and southern wings that had not seen nearly as much success, Napoleon would take a third of his central force and split it between the north and south. 25,000 additional men to each wing would significantly bolster these forces and allow them to expand their own operations before winter hit. In the north, this would likely mean the capture of the important city of Riga, that was besieged historically but would never be captured by the French. In the south, this would mean the expansion of operations into Ukraine, much to the delight of the Poles. It's doubtful, though, that they would ever get anywhere close to Kyiv, but by increasing the pressure to the south and north, Napoleon would improve his supply situation and decrease the chances of his army being defeated in detail before winter. The arrival of Russian reinforcements from the Finnish border in the north and from the now completed war against the Ottomans in the south would check any further French advances. As the campaign wore on, Napoleon grew more and more frustrated with Russia, increasingly decided to support the Poles beyond just words. The Duchy of Warsaw historically briefly attempted to claim the conquered Lithuanian territory that had been lost to Russia during the partitions, but Napoleon limited his support for the effort, viewing it rightly as an obstacle to an eventual peace with Russia. Now he would by necessity give the reconstituted Kingdom of Poland greater support. With more time to consolidate his gains and in need of local support, Napoleon would turn to the Poles to reorganize the occupied territory. Almost all of the conquered territory up to Smolensk had once been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and so many former nobles still resided in the territory that could be convinced to support their cause. Any additional land captured by the southern wing of the army would as well be added to the rapidly expanding new Kingdom of Poland. Direct and official support by Napoleon would certainly boost Polish morale, and was the outcome most feared by the Russians. Even as the campaign progressed historically, there were significant Russian fears that any territory given up to the French risked said territory willingly switching sides to support their enemy. Stabilizing the French army's position in Russia would only be half the struggle for Napoleon, as even if the Russians did not attempt to counterattack to retake Smolensk, he would have to spend significant efforts preparing for the next campaigning season. For the Russians, there would certainly be widespread, adamant demands for the Russian army to drive the French from the Empire's territory after it became clear that Napoleon was halting his offensive for the winter. The question is if enough forces could be gathered in a timely manner to launch such an attack before the winter set in. Such an attack, if launched too soon, would only play into Napoleon's hands, and the odds of gathering enough forces before winter set in fully would be slim. It's entirely possible such a counterattack might be launched, but if so, it would be defeated as the French stayed on the defensive. Back in France, the political situation would begin to turn against Napoleon, as he would be unable to return to Paris until the conclusion of the war against Russia. Concerns over the domestic situation back in France were one of the driving reasons Napoleon historically wanted a quick war against Russia, but such political issues would not ultimately cause significant problems for Napoleon's war effort. The larger issue was the commitment of Prussia and Austria to the war. neither could be called strong allies of Napoleon. Prussia, under Frederick William III, was compelled to join the war as Frederick greatly feared Napoleon, as his country was full of French garrisons and could be easily crushed should the French imperial army ever turn its attention on it. Napoleon was deeply unpopular in Prussia, however, and rather than fight with the French, many Prussian officers defected to serve under the Russians for the course of the war. Until such a time as Russian armies reached Prussia's border properly, the likelihood of Frederick switching sides or withdrawing support from France were slim. Austria, on the other hand, would be a different beast entirely. After the defeat of Austria during the War of the Fifth Coalition, Austria had been forced to give up a number of territories and compelled into an alliance with France. It would deploy a corps 30,000 strong to the war against Russia, but through secret negotiations promised Russia to keep its involvement limited to that number. This agreement led to the southern wing of the invasion, made up mostly of the Austrians, being very passive in the war historically, with reinforcements from the center and Napoleon scrambling to find any way to reinforce his worn-down army. That might change, however. The presence of French troops in the southern wing would compel it to become more active, at least partly into Ukraine. Diplomatically, Napoleon would also likely attempt to negotiate greater Austrian involvement in the war. The Austrian Empire was still large, and Napoleon could not easily compel it to action like with the Prussians. Unless he made considerable concessions, such as giving Dalmatia back to Austria, along with promising them Russian territories that would likely conflict with the Polish desires in Ukraine, the Austrians would be unlikely to provide much additional support. If Napoleon was willing to go that far, however, Austrians may be willing to break their agreement with the Russians and increase their numbers, perhaps doubling their committed force to 60,000. Either way, the southern front would see only limited movements, and by the next campaigning season, neither Austria or Russia would wish to intensify hostilities against each other. The greatest benefit Napoleon could hope for would be that the increased size of the Austrian force would compel the Russians to mirror them with a force of similar size, diverting forces away from the main area of combat. French efforts to raise more men of their own would be difficult at best. Expecting the war to be over quickly due to the overwhelming size of his army, Napoleon would struggle to raise significant additional forces quickly. Any additional troops would have to be gathered, trained, and marched across the continent to reach Russia. He would likely draw more troops away from Spain, but they would still take some time to arrive. His most immediate source of manpower would be from Poland, and even some of the conquered territories, but equipping such forces would be a challenge, on top of supplying the forces already in Russia. Over the course of the 1812-1813 winter, French forces would continue to suffer from a lack of food, raised by Cossacks, and the general misery of winter. It would suffer unavoidable attrition. Unless the Russians dispersed their own forces sufficiently, they too would suffer some of the same problems. Russia is large, and its population at the time was greatly dispersed. What this means is that, besides constant raiding of the French by Cossacks, both sides would see minimal fighting over the winter, allowing them to disperse and giving them time for the next campaigning season to gather to face off once more. Despite his best efforts, Napoleon's army in Russia would likely be about even in size of the Russian army, or perhaps even slightly smaller in 1813. His cavalry in particular would have suffered over the winter for a lack of fodder for the horses. It would not be nearly as weak as historically during the 1813 fighting in Germany, but it still would be a significant issue. For the Russians, the greatly weakened French army would have emboldened them, and the desire from all quarters to go on the attack to drive out the French would compel them to go on the offensive after building up their forces over the winter. Smolensk, as the tip of the French advance, and the place where the majority of the French army had stayed for the winter, would be the obvious target. The Russians going on the offensive would be a boon for Napoleon, as despite his weakened army, he would finally have a chance to achieve a decisive battle against the Russians. Concentrating his forces around Smolensk and calling back those troops he had sent to either wing for the winter, Napoleon would have a force several 100,000 strong at his disposal. What would ensue would be a battle even larger than that of Borodino. Even if outnumbered by the Russians, Napoleon would likely prove his ability once again, inflicting a defeat on the Russian army significantly worse than what they suffered at Borodino. What would remain of the two armies after the battle would be hard to say, but it's very possible that it would have lasted multiple days and been even bloodier than Borodino for both sides. Regardless, the road to Moscow would be open, and Napoleon's army would march forward to seize it without the threat of oncoming winter. None of this would change the fact that Tsar Alexander was determined to not give up the war, and French supply lines were certainly overstretched. Moscow would therefore become an anchor for the French, too valuable to give up, and holding back Napoleon from easily delivering a decisive blow to the Russians, which he would probably believe lay in capturing St. Petersburg. Napoleon would not sit still forever. Eventually, he would make a move towards St. Petersburg, either from Moscow or Riga, perhaps from both at the same time. Whatever the exact series of events, Moscow would be the high water mark of Napoleon's invasion. His supply lines would be too overstretched, his cavalry outmatched, and his army too greatly outnumbered, far from home. Either he would be stopped in battle once numbers proved too great to overcome, or more likely forced to retreat due to his supply lines buckling under Russian pressure. Russia, for its part, would do everything in its power to crush Napoleon's army, a task more easily said than done without the aid of winter. Even with the support of the British, who would be sending significant military support in the form of equipment, the war would be costly for Russia. There would be no sudden collapse of the French army, even as it pulled back to Smolensk. Like the Russians before them, Napoleon may decide to give battle there, unwilling to retreat further, and practically declare his invasion of Russia a complete failure. Even if Napoleon won such a battle, something I believe there is a good chance he could do, the mounting casualties both for the force directly under his command and the northern and southern wings would likely compel him to retreat fully out of Russia, lest he become isolated. His invasion of Russia would not become another peninsular war. The terrain simply did not favor grinding movements of troops back and forth. The Russian army posed too great a threat. Neither would it be the disastrous retreat from Russia that took place historically, however. The French army would exit Russia into Poland intact, if greatly diminished. For Napoleon, that would mean that he would have a decently sized force to rebuild his army around for the fighting in Poland and Germany. A byproduct of the retreat not taking place in winter would be that the Russian army would not suffer nearly as badly either due to the weather. Historically, the Russian army suffered greatly in its efforts to completely destroy the French, and so after entering Poland, had to pause to rebuild their forces. Now there would likely be no such pause until the winter of 1813-14, as both sides fought in the Duchy of Warsaw. For their part, the Poles would continue to support Napoleon, as the fate of a future Polish state would be at stake. Prussia would likely remain neutral for some time until it believed that the momentum had fully turned against Napoleon, while Austria would be even more hesitant to involve itself. How the fighting in Poland would turn out is hard to say. Perhaps Napoleon would win a stunning victory and force Russia to the negotiating table, or he might face a series of setbacks that would mean the fighting would drag well into 1814. Whatever the outcome, he would likely be in a stronger position in terms of horses and quality of his troops. Would he still ultimately lose and be forced to abdicate? Possibly, but not as quickly and not as easily. It would still take all of Europe working together to defeat him. I believe this is a good spot to end this scenario, as any fighting past this point would be very fluid and therefore much harder to predict with any accuracy. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Your support is greatly appreciated as I continue to make these videos.